Good morning. I am Filomena Sendello. I'm very glad to open Abralim meetings this morning. Our speaker today is Dr. Shanti Ulfsbjorninn from the University of Deusto, Bilbao. He got an education from the University of Cambridge, and he has a postdoctoral and he was a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Lyon, France. He is researching now on phonological representations and the interface between phonology and morphology. His talk today is the architectural benefits of getting phonological representations right. Please write down at the chat window your questions. And I thank a lot our speaker and audience this morning.
Okie doke. Can you hear me there? Yeah. Okay. So so today, thanks very much for the people organizing this initiative. It's fantastic. I'm going to be talking today about effectively an old issue about phonology, which is the role of representations, and specifically what does it do for us to have the right phonological representations? Because it seems to me that there are effectively there are huge kind of questions that hinge on whether something can be done in the regular phonology, or whether something needs to be, or whether a process or a phenomenon needs to have extra information from, let's say, from morphology or from syntax and so on. So I'm going to try to take what I think is basically the most minimal notion of phonological representations in symbolic phonology, and effectively see where that takes us. So one sec, because this needs to
try to click.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, it's working now.
Good. Okay. So the first thing to ask is, what are representations made of? And if you take basically any symbolic phonology from the past few decades, I think you would find a great number of people that would agree with the fact that representations are ultimately made of positions and features. The kind of empirical phenomena that shows us that we have positions inside of our representations are things like compensatory lengthening, where we see a segment drop out of a representation. However, its position is retained. And then we see lengthening, vowel lengthening or gemination. We have, for example, the templates of root and pattern morphology, which were proposed by McCarthy originally for Semitic languages, and which, although there's been some debate about whether or not they have a psychological reality, recent evidence from Osishkin et al. Shows that they are somehow used in the lexical retrieval because they have a morphological role to play in the system. So they have a psychological reality over and above just being strings of consonants. And also the work of Noam Faust that's talked a lot about the benefits of using templatic representations in the analysis of morphophonological systems of various Semitic languages. And in all of these kind of languages, you have templates, which are effectively just positions, bare positions, which then get filled with segments, which are essentially bundles of features. So this is a second type of evidence to show us that we have positions inside our representations. Another kind of evidence comes from minimality, like word minimality. in these kind of well-known effects, words, for example, have to be of a certain size, and that size is not determined by segments per se, but it is determined in another way, mostly through weight and important work, for example, from Larry Hyman in 1985, and then later in Hayes, 89, and more recently, Tocquency, 2010. Whatever the details are, the understanding of weight in phonology is that it is digital, and that the phonological, so the if you like, the length of segments inside the phonetic signal can vary significantly, but what phonology cares about for many, many different kinds of processes is a digitalized version of that phonetic signal into symbols of representation that encode this notion of weight. So effectively, this is a 1 and this is a 2, for example, and so on. So those kind of evidence, those kind of sources of evidence show us that representations are made up of positions, and that positions are primitive as part of the representation. That they're not just they're not derived from the number of segments inside that representation. Okay, and then on the other side, what occupies those positions is you have features, and effectively it is basically ubiquitously accepted that all phonological systems are featural. There was some discussion by Sandler about Bedouin Sign Language, and saying how that in that emergent language, it wasn't evident that they had featural phonology. But putting that aside, because it's a complicated question, effectively, like the great majority of basically all phonological systems that we know operate featurally, and that includes sign language. And that, it's basically, the point is that the phonetic signal is cognitively represented as an aggregate of underlying symbols, and those underlying symbols are the features. And we had Mark van Oostendorp's Aberlin talk, and he provided an excellent introduction to the history and discussion of the concept. So I won't labor the point here, but because one could talk about features forever. But basically, the primitives of representation appear to be these positions and features. And here I'm talking across phonological, pretty much across phonological representational models or phonological frameworks. We have these two primitives, positions and features. Now, the positions and features are related to each other by a kind of a third primitive of the representation, and that's the association line. So having accepted that we have these, that our representations are made of this stuff, okay, the next question is, what kind of configurations are we allowed to have of these primitives inside our exponents? Or another way of putting it, what are the exponents made of? Now, before I talk about that for just 1 second, I would like to mention what I think is basically one of the coolest aspects of the minimalist program, and that is that although phonology appears, at least it has been argued by a number of different people from very, very different positions, from very different starting assumptions, it's been argued that phonology is effectively flat, meaning that the positions that we have and the features are related to each other in two distinct and independent tiers, and that you only have that flat tier of positions and a flat tier of bundles of features or segments. Okay, and and of course syntax is not bounded by that at all. But the coolest thing about the minimalist program, in my opinion, in this sense, is that syntax generates representations, those representations that we draw as trees, and it does so through structure building. And the representational outcomes of that structure building are potentially infinite. And what's cool about this is that it actually follows from the simplicity of the structural building mechanism in syntax, because merge is a simpler structure building operation. And since it's the simplest, it's therefore it's the most reasonable to assume evolved in humans, seeing as that's a condition on evolvability, simplicity. Merge, being the simplest structure building operation, makes unbounded infinite structures automatically. So that if you wanted to reduce or restrict the possible representations that are generated in syntax, if you wanted to make that into a smaller set, you'd actually have to introduce conditions on merge, saying that the operational component, and that would actually make the operational component of language more complex. So that if you want less structures, you have to introduce more conditions in the operational component. Now, coming back to phonology, which I would agree with various people, it's flat. So it's going to be much smaller in scope and scale than in syntax. But the same logic is in operation, which is what organizations of primitives are allowed? And the answer is all of them. Assuming 2 tiers and assuming flatness, you are allowed to have any arrangement of those things, positions and features, since they are independent tiers. Now, there are various theoretical specific or theory specific names for these things, so positions and features. Some of them, for example, for positions, as you can see on the slide, some of those for positions will be X-lot or Mora or CV unit, right? Pieces of structure. And then the F is feature or an element. Now, for the rest of this talk, I'm going to be talking about this in terms of in the representational language of strict CV. So I'm assuming that the skeletal structures are CV units, and that the features, well, actually I won't be talking about the features. So the features are just the features, like segments or elements, whatever you want to call them, okay? Since we have these 2 tiers of representation, which can be mediated through association lines, the shapes of exponents, the exponents of morphemes can come in various shapes. So you can have the classical sort of vanilla fixed exponent, where you have a syllable structure position attached to a segment, and that will be something like just any old suffix. Okay, then you could also have the feature but without a position. A feature without a position, or a bundle of features without a position, will be something like a floating tone, or a floating segment, or a floating feature, for example, in umlaut. It will be effectively, it's a feature without a position. Conversely, you could have morphemes, you can have exponents of morphemes that are made just of positions without any segmental content. We've known this for a very long time. So that as an analysis of these facts. So you can have just the position and not the feature or the segment. So a classical process that might operate like this will be raddoppiamento sintattico or raddoppiamento fonsintattico, as analyzed, for example, in strict CV by Passino, also by D'Alessandro and Scheer. And in these, however, this is very much equivalent to an empty mora, okay, being introduced into the phonological representation as an exponent of a morpheme. So we have fixed, floating, empty, and also the possibility of having having positions and having features and segments inside a representation that do not have that are not, however, underlyingly associated with an association line. Now, this use of association lines is very important, as we're going to see later on. And various effects can be generated from this. Now, so basically what this is saying is that we should move away from the alphabetic notion of exponents and think of them more in terms of phonological representation, seeing as these are cognitive units, right? And the cognitive units are made up of these positions, and they're made up of features and the association lines between them. And so an exponent can be made of any of the possible combinations of position and feature, both, like just repeating this point. So position and feature, just structure, or structure and feature, but not mediated through an association line. Now, the first, I'm going to show you how that helps us a little bit in a sec. But yeah, so what can this do for us, these kind of representations? Well, one of the things it can do is that it can help us decide between item and process type morphology and item and arrangement type morphology. The theory of item and arrangement type morphology is that effectively you have a realizational morphological phonological interaction where you have just concatenation of bits or pieces, which of course, right, concatenation of pieces, and those pieces come together to form the phonological representations that act as the exponents for the morphemes. Now, however, there are a whole range of phonological phenomena, morphophonological phenomena, that look like you need more than just putting together of pieces. When you're talking about morphophonology, some of those things will be like a subtractive process, like you can see on your slide. That will be something, this is a hypothetical one, where, for example, the singular is unmarked, and the plural is marked by the removal of one of the segments of the singular. And this kind of process where, for example, you couldn't analyze this as being a singulative system, this would be as I think Goldsmith might have put it as the subtractive processes are just a fact of life, right? And this kind of morphological process this kind of morphological process does not look like it can be analyzed with just the addition of pieces or the stringing together of parts. However, this and many other non-concatenative processes actually have been in recent times reanalyzed exactly as item and arrangement in clever ways. And we can see this especially with the work of Jochen Trummer, Eva Zimmermann, also Mark van Oostendorp and Roberto Alessandro in an article together. There are various ways in which actually you can reanalyze these effects in an item and arrangement method. I'm going to show you an example of that now with Wolof. Now, Wolof, has various kinds of affixations, and one of the types of affix that it has, two of the kinds of affixes that it has look like classic item and process type affixes, or type processes. Sorry. However, these, I'm going to show you, these can be reanalyzed as item and arrangement. So if you look at the slide that I've put online, you'll see that Wolof has what I've called normie affixes. Okay, normie affix. That's basically, it's an affix that doesn't do anything special to anything. Okay, so you literally just put the root, like lem, you add e, you get lemmy, end of story. Okay, but it also has things like additive affixes. That is where you would get, for example, the same root, fold, you add the reversive, and now you get gemination of one of the segments of the root. Now, so you get lem, and then lemmi with the lemmi with the geminate. Now, so in this case, we have an addition. This affix looks like it's adding something to the root. We also have a very particular case of subtractive affixing in Wolof. So that, for example, a root that ends in a geminate, when it's concatenated with the causative suffix al, actually undergoes a process of degemination. So son can be demonstrated on its own to have an underlying final geminate n, but when you add the suffix, the gemination goes away. This kind of subtractive affix, right, looks very much like an item and process style operation, where you have to transform your form into the degeminated form in this morphological context. And look at it next to a normie affix that looks segmentally incredibly similar to the causative, and that's the benefactive. So if you have a root with a final geminate g plus al, which is the benefactive, the underlying form of the benefactive, it's argued. Okay, in this case, this is a normie affix, and it doesn't trigger degemination. So nothing about the segmental shape of the inputs, at least prima facie, seems to be driving the difference between a subtractive affix and a normie affix. Now, for the additive affix, this is actually the kind of basically the easier type to understand with structure in an item and process, in an item and arrangement type model. Okay, I put the representation of the affix e. Oh, with the wrong example though. With an example. Okay, and that is the additive affix. Okay, has an extra space. So it has an extra CV, or it has an extra empty more, and it's that empty more that gets spread into in order to produce the gemination in, for example, lem e, lem me. Okay. Now, in that sense, that's relatively easy to understand in an item and arrangement process. But what about underneath those two structures that I have, son plus al? Now, this is the subtractive affix. Okay. Now, in order to have so in order to have the subtractive affix, now this subtractive affix is being put just not with a final geminate, but just with a final singleton consonant. Okay, in the analysis of that affix is that it begins like Heather Newell has proposed for L1 affixes in English. It begins with a floating vowel, which is one of our configurations, if you remember. It's one of our configurations of linguistic matter or linguistic stuff. Okay. Now the floating a of that affix has a position to dock to in the root if it ends in a consonant. And so what you'll see is a linking of that vowel to the position. And it will produce no change to the root effectively. Okay. Now, if you add this to any other consonant final root, you're going to get the same effect. And notice that, like in the bottom example on your slide now, if this has nothing to do with prosodic structure, so that if you have a long vowel, like a heavy syllable inside your root, it's not that subtractive affix is going to take away one of the mores of your root. It's just going to situate itself in that final position, just as it does with any other final consonant stem. Okay, so in order to understand the degemination, I propose that the final geminates in Wolof are the other kind of organization of linguistic structure, namely unfixed. So that the geminate in a form like bet, okay, or like a root with a final geminate, has a floating consonant and it has the skeletal position for a geminate, so that there is space for the geminate as part of the root, but underlyingly, those geminates are unstable. They are unfixed, meaning that they will be fixed, okay, depending on the phonological conditions that are around them. Then their realization, because they're unfixed, is contingent on their phonological surroundings. So you have the word final space for the geminate. You could analyze this as an empty mora if you want, okay, but you would get the same effect. And then you introduce and then you have the floating affix, and the floating affix, because it's floating and because the root is unfixed, has the extra space, the affix can actually move into the space of the root and take up the position that would be occupied by that final floating segment if there were no affix. So if there were no affix, the T would fill the space and you would get a geminate. But if you have a floating affix that goes in, it takes up the space. There's a little bit of an additional computational thing that happens, but I don't want to go into the details too much because they are theory specific, okay? But what I'm describing here is basically theory neutral, which is that you have an unfixed geminate, floating affix, and the floating affix, however you understand it in your framework, takes up the space that would be taken up by that geminate, so that you end up with just a singleton T as part of the computed form, which you see in C. Now, this is strictly compared to the fixed version of that, of a otherwise segmentally identical affix, or pretty much identical affix, in which, as you can see on the slide now, the benefactive is a normie affix, a normal affix. Okay, so it's linked to its position, and as it is linked, and that's the minimal difference between it and the floating affix of the benefactive. The geminate takes up the space that it needs. There's a little bit of extra computation, which is theory specific, but ignore it if you want. Okay, but the T takes up its space. The affix has its space, and that's why this benefactive. This should be benefactive. Sorry, this benefactive affix, which is fixed, doesn't trigger degemination of the root. So the minimal difference between a benefactive and a causative would be whether or not the material of that or the segments inside it are linked or not. Okay, and it creates an item and arrangement analysis of degemination, where you don't need to have a special process type rule or whatever, or extra computation which is morpheme specific to that affix in order to generate the degemination. You can do this using just the configurations of linguistic matter that are available to us, which are, again, you have your normal affixes which are fixed, then you have floating material and empty positions. If you actually use those possibilities, these empty positions and these floating features or floating segments. These processes actually can be quite easily understood as item and arrangement type processes. And again, I want to re-echo here that this particular point is basically theory independent, as long as you as long as you are already at the point of having positions and segments and association lines. But once you've got that, which is kind of shared by the great majority of linguists, then everything else is okay and follows. Okay, now, so coming to modularity and basically architecture. I want to show that that having a richer set of representations, which actually comes from a more minimal understanding of phonological representations, where you just have the positions and the segments, okay, and all the possible varieties, all the possible configurations that follow from that, can help us to actually promote a minimalist architecture. In the sense of the strong minimalist thesis, where you have the idea that, or the shopping list, basically, that you want to have all your structures generated by merge, and then have an interaction with the interfaces, or that you have, and specifically, you have this Y model or T model in the architecture of grammar, where you have the syntax spell out, and then you have morphology, phonology, and then later phonetics even as distinct modules inside that system. Now, modularity of this type, why do we want this? I think it's, I would say, because it keeps the same types of information in together effectively. So syntactic information is with the syntax, ideally, although this isn't always that, phonological information is with the phonology, and phonetic information is in the phonetics, and everything is in its place. So there's no mixing. Modularity in that sense is groovy, because it's a nice hypothesis, and it's interesting to see basically if we can make it work empirically. Various people have been defending this notion of modularity. For example, like Heather Newell most fervently, most recently, but also actually in Kaelin's work of 2018, where basically she analyzes a case of allomorphy, where you have morphology first and then the phonology. So you have this modular interaction between phonology and morphology. Now the system is feed forward and it's universal, so it's something to pursue. Now, so let's take some examples of where this is possible, or how to analyze these things. Problems with that kind of architectural model that we've seen are any morphophonological processes that appear to be non-modular, where we have, for example, the morphological, phonologically conditioned allomorphy, where the morphological insertion depends on phonological factors. So clearly, like in the Spanish case that I'm going to discuss right now, these would not be morphology then phonology. There would be some kind of interaction between these two systems. I'm going to show you a more egregious case of that in a second. But so just to kick us off with phonologically conditioned allomorphy, consider in Spanish that we get a masculine allomorph appearing before stressed a words. So, for example, agua is a feminine noun, but it takes the masculine article, el agua, right? Now, the stressed nature of that, the phonological aspect of this is very important. It has to be a, no other vowel will do it. It has to be stressed, even if it's a. So, for example, la amiga, yeah, doesn't become el amiga, okay? Also, the determiner and the noun have to be adjacent, so that if you have the plural, then you get las with the feminine la plus the plural marker, las aguas. You don't get el aguas or something like that. Now, it's important to note that the agreement here, the syntactic agreement of this noun, which is marked with L, which is the masculine version of that allomorph, is the masculine allomorph of the definite article. The agreement treats the noun just as if it's feminine. So you get el agua hermosa. You would not get el agua hermoso. There are some exceptions to, so as far as the syntax is concerned, this noun is feminine. However, it has the morphological marker of masculine. Now, there are some complications and interesting factors that are really cool and should be looked into more, that for example, James Harris has written about. But I want to talk more, I want to talk very very basically, if you like, about the analysis of these facts. And the first is that in order for the phonologically conditioned allomorphy to work, okay, the idea is that there's a competition of insertion between the masculine L and the feminine la, and then in the plural los and las. And so if you, so one way of understanding this actually is using mascaro and bonnet and mascaro and the concept of priority, the notion that you have the affix L, the affix la, and they're competing for insertion, and they need to make reference to the phonological shape of the item in order to make that decision. However you're going to do it, they use a factorial typology OT type system where the constraint ranking will help you decide which one you're going to take. Okay, which obviously this for me, although it's not an egregious example of modularity violation in that sense, is still not something that I would, still not an ideal optimal system from a modular perspective, because it would be more streamlined to have just a straightforward unified insertion of an exponent for a morpheme, and not have this kind of insertion based on this this vocabulary insertion, making reference to phonological facts that come after. Now, I'll show you now very quickly how that's possible. You might have even been able to predict it, what I'm going to say. Let's see. And that is that there's a way of analyzing this without using anti-modular allomorphy. In fact, actually, there's a way to analyze this without using allomorphy at all. Okay, and that meaning that here there isn't a competition for insertion, there isn't priority established in the lexicon for lexical insertion. There is literally just the insertion of one single underlying form that then generates all the surface forms, including these funny masculines, these funny el agua, these funny cases where like the definite article looks like it's masculine. But I'm going to show you that's pure phonology. That's not a morphological addition, okay, of masculine. So on the next column of that handout, okay, what we can ask ourselves: can we create a unified morphological analysis of the definite article in Spanish? And here I have various colors, as you can see. There is the yellow, which is the material which is being. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me just, before I start, a unified morphological analysis of the definite article, meaning that the definite article is actually composed of pieces that are exponents for morphemes. So definiteness, the morpheme of definiteness, is everything in yellow in this slide that you have. The five features are expressed by what you see in green, which is the inserted vowel a. And then I include it just for visual sake, because I don't assume that it's part of the underlying representation, of course, but in blue, I show you the position of epenthesis, okay? And there's this idea that since you have two, the definite, okay, is made up of two CV units. Effectively, it's like it has two mores, okay? And which is two mores with an L in the onset of the second. And if and the material is floating, so that the feminine, when it's there, is introduced as an a or as an o. Sorry, the masculine as an o, but it's floating. If one of those positions is filled, then the other one is empty. However, if the rightmost V position is empty, then you have to get epenthesis. So on this understanding, the masculine that we see in el agua is literally just epenthesis. The e of the masculine, the e that looks like the masculine allomorph, the part of the masculine allomorph, is actually just the epenthetic e of Spanish. And this analysis, by the way, I should have said right from the beginning, this analysis actually is exactly the same as Kikuchi's analysis, although he frames it in OT, but it's the same analysis, okay? Which is that the masculine's e of el agua is actually epenthetic. Now, that makes the fact that the agreement of agua as being feminine, even though it has el, is completely unsurprising, because there is no masculine in el agua at all at any point in any part of the representation. It's always feminine, and so as you see in the structure beneath, okay, if you fill the la, then you can avoid having the epenthetic e. So in la tia, that's what happens, right? But in the masculine, the filled, you get epenthesis of the e. Okay, when you get that structure that you have on top with the floating a and the floating e, when you have that structure meeting a unstressed a, you get coalescence, no problem. When that a meets a stressed vowel, you can't get coalescence for the reason that coalescence is rejected by the stressed vowel. And because you can't get coalescence, you have this hiatus of these two identical vowels, which triggers deletion, and then the epenthesis of e. So that's why you get el agua. Now, this analysis makes very short work of the fact that in the plural, you get the feminine las aguas, not los aguas, right? Or anything else, anything you can imagine, els aguas or whatever. Okay, and that's because the plural s disrupts the locality between the exponent of the 5 feature a and the stressed vowel that follows. Because it's disrupted and it has an empty position, that s has an empty position for the vowel, then the 5 feature, the 5 features exponent, the feminine 5 feature exponent, is linked, and given that it's linked, you don't get epenthesis before it. So here we get the straightforward feminine las aguas. Now, we could talk a little bit about the details of the analysis. Like the details of the analysis I just gave, I gave them in a sort of strict CV. Is it perfect? Is it clear? I'm not 100%, but I want you to consider the possibility that from any theoretical perspective, that having a unified morphological analysis with a slightly richer non-alphabetic notion of what this underlying form is that we're adding in to the phonology, Okay, so we have more configurations, empty positions, floating structure. Okay, the fact that we have these positions, the fact we have the shape of the representation can allow us to construct a analysis where there is no allomorph selection here, there's no allomorph competition, there's no priority, and there's no masculine at any point in the structure. Now, I'm going to end basically on this case study here for reasons of time. And it's another case, perhaps a more salient case, and it's one that I've worked more on, which is a case where we seem to need morpheme-specific phonology, and I'm going to show you that the logic of using theoretical models where you have to make reference to morphemes specifically, like with lexically indexed constraints, morpheme-specific phonology, however you do it, okay, that is unnecessary, and the logic of it doesn't follow. So the example here comes from Bilbao Spanish. The process here comes from Bilbao Spanish, and specifically the deletion that we get in this dialect specifically, or in a city specifically. It's probably more broad than Bilbao, but it's basically, I'm describing this is the city I live in now, so I'm describing the Spanish of here, if you like. So and in different parts of the Spanish-speaking world, the facts I'm going to tell you vary massively. Okay, so I think the Bilbao Spanish is one of the most interesting versions of this for what we're talking about, because we seem to have morpheme specificity and a mixing of morphological and phonological information at the same time. So just a quick thanks, because I've spoken about this very explicitly with, in a lot of detail with John Ortiz de Urbina, with Chico Torres Tamarit, with Carlos Arregui, with Noam Faust. So it works like this. In Bilbao Spanish, de-deletion, we get a process of de-deletion, okay, de-deletion in the participle. So for example, in a word like cortado, which is cort, a, which is the theme of the stem, basically, which is the participle, and then the masculine singular o, cortado, in standard Spanish becomes cortao. And for some speakers, especially lower class, especially more Basque speakers, you get cortao. Lo cortao. Same thing with something like pescado, fish, which is from pescar. This is like the fished, right? The thing which is fished. Here we get pescado. The pronunciation would be pescao, or pescao, if with a slightly less raised vowel. Okay. Now, this is not obviously just a phonological process, because it only affects the D of the participle. It affects the D in an identical sequence where the stress is the same and the flanking vowels are the same. If that D is not the D of the participle, it doesn't delete. It is reduced, it is lenited, but you can always hear a little bit of it, right? That the lenited form is going to be very lenited in many cases. El dado, I can't really do it, but el dado, that's too hard. But something they can go really light with it, el dado. But it's still there. Whereas if you have, so that's dice, because the root there is dad, and then you have the o of the singular, so dado. Now, if, however, this was the, then a, then the of the participle, and then o, they can say dao or dao. Dao, give, participle. A form, there aren't too many words exactly of the shape, but in a word like, for example, sado, again, the root is sad plus o. We don't get the deletion. We just get lenition of the D. So we get sado. But if we had a participle, he pensado, I thought. Okay, he pensado. Now we have the D deletion, the full D deletion. Now the D deletion doesn't happen if with other affix Ds. So for example, in pescador, we don't get pescaur or pescaor. I guarantee you never, 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 never. I hope that there are people listening to this or who see this later who are from Bilbao or from the surrounding regions, and I guarantee you that they will be shaking their head. Okay, they don't say it. Now, the only exception to what looks like deletion that isn't lexical, that isn't of a participle D, is something which is actually clearly lexicalized. So, for example, in Spanish, there's a word for on the corner, or by the corner in the metaphorical sense of corner, like over there, yeah. And in that case, you get lao, and the root should presumably be lad, right? Because it comes from the word side, lado. However, notice there's a meaning difference actually between, and it shows you that the D deletion here is fully lexicalized. So that if you're saying on the corner, you would say está al lado. Whereas if you're saying literally this is the side of something, you would say el lado de, and you would not say el lado de. It doesn't happen. So what are the conditions on D deletion? It happens only in the A stems. So like pensado, right? Pensado. It doesn't happen like in 4 with the E stems. So comido doesn't become comiu, or querido doesn't become querido. And it happens only in front of the masculine. So pescada and cortada stay pescada, cortada, but they do not become pesca, corta, as they do in other dialects of Spanish. And it really is before masculine, not just masculine singular. For example, if you say han sido cortados, meaning they have been cut, you cannot have han sido, because that's an E stem. Then cortado is an A stem, but then you have the A stem with a participle D in front of the masculine, okay? And here you would, in the plural, okay? And you get the D deletion and the diphthong. So you get han sido cortados, or cortaos. It depends how much you raise. Now, this thing is fully productive in the appropriate register. If you ask, for example, local speakers to change the stress in order to show that this thing can't be a participle and give them a non-word, like sorado, then they're not going to delete the D. If, however, you give them a form with stress right in front of it, they can understand this as a participle of an unknown verb, and therefore they do apply the D deletion. So sorao, right? But remember, stress is not a sufficient condition. Okay, if you remember, like in, for example, in sado, yeah, stress is not a sufficient condition for the process to happen. But in 8, Søren, you see there is a phonological condition of stress, okay, where the stress does seem to matter, where if you or at least adjacency with O seems to matter. And so in cortadito, which is a diminutive form of cortao, which would undergo D deletion, you don't get D deletion in here, and so you get cortadito. So morphemes. So to summarize, what is this process? It is morpheme specific because it affects only the participle. It is anti-modular because it looks like it requires both morphological information and phonological information, because there are phonological aspects to the rule. Now, a fully phonological analysis is a priori preferable, because if it can be done, why? Because we are manipulating phonological features. We're in the phonology for sure. Okay, so we might as well try and do everything in the phonology, because we're already in there. We know we're in there. Now, we might suppose also that there's a connection between the structural change and the structural description of the rule. That is to say, the O going to all only, the D deletion only happens in the environment A and R. It doesn't happen in the environment E and R. You could understand this with a morphological class feature or something, but then it would be arbitrary, okay? Moreover, it would be arbitrary if the O to U raising that you get in cortau as a possible version of cortau, yeah? Cortau, that raising happens only ever if there is D deletion and never independently, okay? And those, the Spanish lexicon, on top of it, has these al diphthongs, but not eel diphthongs or eel hiatuses. So the solution seems, I think, it follows pretty clearly from this, which is that we have to redefine the problem here. The morpheme specificity, okay, necessarily there's this myth that morpheme specificity or morpheme specificity of a phonological process necessarily requires listing this in the lexicon or using a lexically indexed constraint or something like that, okay? Why is it a myth? It's a myth because the idiosyncratic behavior of that item can be blamed or attributed to the UR's shape of its, to the shape of its underlying form of the exponent. So a D is a D is a D. No, we saw already right from the beginning that we had actually configurations of our that our exponents can come in various configurations. There's fixed D and there's floating D, and the latter, the passing of that D depends on it linking to the skeleton. That is contingent on its phonological surroundings. So there is D which is fixed and which stays, and there is D which is dependent on its surroundings. And that's a lexical fact. Sorry, that's a fact about the underlying shape of the exponent. So is it a magical diacritic? No, right? It's not a diacritic at all, actually, because it is just one of the possible configurations of stuff, unless you a priori refuse to consider that you can have floating segments and position and empty positions. How can a child learn it? Easy. The behavior of the thing. If it's fixed, it doesn't. If it's fixed, it has an association line, and it never alternates with zero. If it alternates with zero, you know the set of universal grammar configurations, and so you blame that on the fact that that D is unlinked, or another way of putting it, you learn that that D is unlinked. Now, so the analysis therefore is just that the A is able to license an U diphthong, E cannot in Spanish. That's a general fact about Spanish. I'm finishing up now. Okay, and therefore, in Spanish, the shape of the participle is just a floating D. It has a floating D and a phi feature, which is the O. When it can, you will create a diphthong, and in those cases, you will get potential raising of R to U. Okay, but if for whatever reason you cannot have that R in that diphthong position, then you have to link the D. So that would be something that happens, for example, in E stems, okay, E participles that don't allow that don't license the U as part of the diphthong. Therefore, you have to link D. And here, it's not a coincidence that the O cannot raise to U, because it's in a different syllabic position to the O that links to create the diphthong in an A root. So all in all, we can blame the morpheme-specific behavior of D on its underlying shape, and all of the other factors of that process, i.e. the raising, okay, follow from the same condition. So if the representations are right, therefore, everything is in the phonology. I just add the participle D into an A stem, into an E stem. I add the 5 feature exponents, whatever they are, and you just let the phonology do the thing, and it produces the right forms. So if the representations are right, then the rules will follow true. And the same is actually true of the whole architecture, in the sense that we don't have to have modularity violations just because in Bilbao Spanish we have cortao, but not comido. Okay, so I would ask everyone to embrace a more representational variety, a more representational variety of your URs, more possibilities in their shapes, which actually is a minimal proposition, not a maximum proposition, and let the phonology work for you. So thanks very much. And that's pretty much it. So I look forward to your question.
Thank you, Shanti. And I have a couple of questions. Can you hear me?
I can. I'm just going to try to get rid of this. Hold on.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay. So I have 2 general questions, and then I will give a more specific example to understand what I'm talking about. First,
Okay.
I'd like to know how do you deal in your model with metathesis and the fission, like fission in distributed morphology?
Yeah. Right. So the question of, well, metathesis. Metathesis can be metathesis is something that I've worked on a little bit, and one of the ways in which it can operate is that, for example, you will have floating segments, like let's say a consonant and a vowel, which are floating, and the vowel will preferentially link to a position to the left, and this can give, sometimes it can give the semblance of metathesis when actually you don't really have a reordering of segments. You just have the movement of a segment over a fixed linear order. So for example, in if you have if you have D and then O, let's say, and then you attach the O to form a diphthong, the D doesn't actually have to necessarily swap places with the O in order to get the reordering. So yeah, so that's one type of metathesis that I think can be understood in this way relatively easily. A different one, which is more complicated, obviously, is the cases where it really looks like you're moving, like really where it really looks like you're swapping. Let's say something an R and an L, and suddenly they look like they're really swapped. Like in, however, many of these processes are actually quite diachronic. Okay, these processes where we have where we know what the underlying form was, and we know that what am I saying? We know that the historical form had, let's say, an R and an L, like in parabola palabra, okay? Mm-hmm. And then we know that the modern version of that word has the opposite order of R and L, but we don't necessarily know that there was a phonological process that moved those R and L with each other. All we know is that we have an underlying form. Sorry, all we know is that we have one linguistic variety with one order of R and L and another one with a different order. And that, of course, could be understood through lexicalization and child language acquisition in many ways.
Well, I'll give you an example that let me use the chat. Okay, so it's about a South American Indian language called Mocovi. So in Mocovi, usually subject, it's about agreement. So subject agreement is a prefix, and then there is the verbal root, and then a suffix for the object. So for all persons except for second person. Second person cannot be a prefix. I don't know the reason. So we cannot have a prefix for second person subject, and then it's reversed. So the object will be the prefix, and the subject will be the suffix. So it seems to be a metathesis. I would think that it's linked and then unlinked, like unfixed, and then the reversal happens. It's a way. Do you have another idea?
No, I think it's a very interesting phenomenon. It looks like a very interesting phenomenon. I don't know what the analysis would be offhand. I mean, like, or it's not really for me even to analyze it. But I would say that, yeah, I could see how you might analyze this in the way that you described. And I would only add to that the fact that in some languages it looks like we have we have grammatical metathesis, like for example in the language for, where it looks like when you put two affixes together, you have a swapping around in order to create, let's say, what looks like a better phonological sequence. So those cases are things that need to be looked at carefully and properly and so on. I'm afraid, no, I wouldn't be able to analyze that thing just like that, but I look forward to seeing it.
Okay, and how about fission? So sometimes like a morpheme, which is a prefix, goes to the end of the stem. How would you analyze fission? Because it's something very controversial in the literature.
Right. I mean, I think one of the big, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems to me that the main issue here is whether or not a DM is correct in saying that you can only spell out terminals. And if you and I'm not sure that is actually something that people would necessarily defend that strongly nowadays, especially with, for example, nanosyntactic approaches that have a totally different understanding of like whether or not you can spell out whole chunks or just the terminals. So I'm not sure if fission really is a valid process. Maybe in the sense that perhaps it's just an effective spell out, and that we're wrong when we say that we can only interpret terminal nodes. Why is that important? I think it's super important from an architectural perspective, because fission is not a syntactic operation, not a phonological operation necessarily, although I guess you could sort of see it as coalescence perhaps, but it's not really even that. We get coalescence in phonology, but that's really just like putting two things together. It's not really I'm not sure it's really equivalent to fission. Or fusion, sorry, fusion. So I would say that those processes in distributed morphology, which are not actually syntactic operations, are themselves suspect, because those aren't operations that seem to exist in any of the major modules. So not in the syntax, not in the phonology necessarily. So all I would say there is that I don't really know, but the suspect. Yeah.
I don't know it either.
No, I think it's I think it's for people that are. I think it's a really important question.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So I'm satisfied. Probably there is no more questions. So I thank you very much for your presentation today. Quite interesting. And so come to Brazil. We have lots of languages to be analyzed.
It's my pleasure. And obviously, like, I imagine that there's, if anyone wants to write to me with any questions or whatever, I will do my best to answer them. So thank you very much for your hospitality.
You.
Virtual.
Enjoy.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.